Harvester Christian Church. It's great to be here with you on this Christmas Eve. You know, I don't know about you, but I love a good story. I love a good movie, a good book, a good story. I just love to know how that happens. But you know what I love more than a good story is knowing how a good story is put together. And I am notorious for reading the first chapter of a book and then reading the last chapter of a book and then reading the rest of the book, because I not only like to know what point A and point B are, I really like to know how the author is going to get from point A to point B. How are you going to bring this story from this part to this part? And it's interesting when you start looking at stories, when you start looking at movies and books and things like that, that almost every good story is composed in the same manner, has the same three elements. It has three acts, Act 1, 2, and 3. And in the first act of almost every story, we're introduced to the hero. And this formula for storytelling has been around since the ancient Greeks. And in the first act, you're introduced to the hero. You're introduced, and you find out everything you need to know about that. But in a sense, what you do is the author does is it says, in the first act, I'm going to tell you who the hero is, and I'm going to run the hero up a tree. I'm going to put him in a predicament. And then in Act 2, I'm going to start throwing rocks at him. And I'm going to make it look like he's not going to make it out of the tree. And then in Act 3, we're going to get our hero down out of the tree. Almost every movie you watch, almost every book you read, narrative book, right, has those same three acts. We're going to see our hero grow up the tree, we're going to throw rocks at him, and then we're going to get him down. And as we look at the Christmas story, I'm telling you this not because you want a lesson in literary criticism, but I think it's helpful for us to understand how the Gospel of John, as he tells the Christmas story, as he tells the story of Jesus, uses the same formula. Now, John isn't giving us some fanciful legend. He's telling us what actually happened. But the Apostle John tells us the story of Jesus using those same three elements. But he tells us something really important about the life of Jesus. And today, just for a few seconds, I'd like to look at the Gospel of John in three acts. And this will be quick, but I hope that you will catch on to what the Gospel of John is telling us. And then I want to tell you something important about it when we get to the end. But in Act 1, we begin in John chapter 1. Remember, Act 1 is, let's meet our hero, right? And the Gospel of John starts off with this. In chapter 1, verse 1, the first 5 verses. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him not anything was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now, John tells the story of Jesus with a different beginning than Matthew and Luke. And we're at Christmas Eve, right? And we're celebrating Christmas, and you're familiar with how Matthew and Luke tell the story. Matthew tells us about the wise men and Herod and the angel coming to Joseph. And the Gospel of Luke tells us about the angel coming to Mary and John the Baptist and Elizabeth and Zechariah and the shepherds. And when you put those two different perspectives of the story together, you have what we think of as the Christmas story. As we usually tell it, we combine those two together. But when John goes to tell his story of Jesus, he's telling it many years later. And John assumes that you know what Matthew and Luke have already told you about the birth of Jesus. So he's not trying to tell the same story, but what he's going to do is tell us the same story, but in a very symbolic way. You see, John uses the story of Jesus and the image of Jesus coming into the world as light. And he says, in the beginning was the Word, and this Word was the light of the world. And when John starts talking about light and using these images like light and things like that, what he's doing is he's saying that God came to earth as light and that the light illuminated the darkness. That what Jesus did was he came into a very dark world. He came into a world that was dark, not literally dark, but symbolically dark. And in a sense, our existence was dark. We see at the beginning of creation, the world was dark. And God transformed the darkness. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, right? God created the heavens and the earth. And the world was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the water. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God transformed the darkness by introducing light into it. And then when sin enters into the world in Genesis chapter 3, it's like the power goes off and darkness descends on the earth again. Not literal darkness, but spiritual darkness. And ever since Genesis chapter 3, the world has been in this spiritual darkness. And John tells us that when Jesus enters into the world, which he literally did, but he tells us in this spiritual way that Jesus comes in and introduces light into it. And this light begins to flicker in the sense of the hope flickers, just like whenever you light a fire. You just start off, it flickers a little bit, right? And it's just getting going with enough fuel to go. And when Jesus enters the world, it was the beginning, if you will, of a new creation. John uses the creation language that says, just as God created the world in the beginning, and he introduces light into it, and then the world goes dark, now Jesus comes into the world, and he is bringing light. He is bringing spiritual light into the world again. You see, Jesus was born into a very dark world. And when Jesus comes, the light of hope begins to flicker to life. And just like the sparks of a fire, the light begins to take hold and to grow and to spread. And we have Act 1 in the Gospel of John. The light flickers to life as Jesus enters into the world. So now we've seen Jesus, and he's here in this world. But remember what Act 2 is. What are we going to do in Act 2? We're going to throw rocks at our hero, right? He's up the tree, and now he's going to be in trouble. And in the rest of the Gospel of John, what we see is that Jesus begins to get rocks thrown at him, literally and figuratively and literarily. And that's what we get to Act chapter 2, the second act, right, is that the light begins to fade. So the light comes into the world, but as Jesus is in this world, it seems like the light fades. And think about all the things that Satan did to sort of extinguish the light that Jesus brought into the world by killing Jesus. And we know this from several of the Gospels, that Herod tries to kill the babies. Herod tries to snuff out the light. That Satan tried to tempt Jesus into changing his mission and extinguish the light. The crowds tried to turn Jesus into an earthly king. The Jewish leaders falsely accused Jesus of rebellion. The Romans tried to execute Jesus, and they were successful. They brought up these false charges with him, and they said, oh, he's claiming to be a rebel. And of course they do, and they thought that they were in charge. And with the crucifixion, right, so we go through the whole Gospel of John, and we get down to chapter 19. And with the crucifixion, it really does seem as though the light of the world has been snuffed out. John chapter 19, starting in verse 23. It says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and they divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, and also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven into one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but let's cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. And thus it was fulfilled in the scripture which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. And after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. And a jar full of sour wine stood there, and so they put it on a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch, and they held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head, and he gave up his spirit. With the crucifixion, it seems as though the light has faded. It seems as though whatever goodness Jesus brought into the world gets snuffed out. And when Jesus dies on the cross, the disciples scatter in fear and shame. The women weep and mourn. The Jewish leaders gloat in victory. I'm sure they had a toast or two to celebrate the fact that they had gotten rid of their archenemy. The Romans thumped their chest in pride at keeping the peace. And the crowds that were so in love with Jesus just a week before now turn their attention to the next spectacle to be seen. And in the second act, the light fades as Jesus is laid in the tomb. But thank goodness there's 3 acts. There's not just 2. And now in the third act, what we're going to see is that the light that seems to have faded when Jesus came into the world is going to shine brightly. John chapter 20, verse 19. On the evening of that day, on the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them. And he said, "Peace be with you." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Now, God's plan all along, right? God's plan all along was more than any human understood. All throughout the Bible, prophets spoke of something that was going to happen in the future, and they gave little breadcrumbs and little clues through the things that they wrote. But none of them understood the entire story. The ending of the story was one that no one saw coming. The apparent defeat on the cross. I mean, you think about that. Here's the light that comes into the world, and what do the very people that Jesus came to save do to him? They kill him. That was the ending that no one saw coming. But then we see the real ending. When the light seems to fade into nothing, God raised Jesus from the grave. And the light broke through once and for all into our world, and it shines into eternity. Indeed, the story of Christmas that we're all celebrating this weekend, the Nativity, Act 1, was just that. It was Act 1. To truly appreciate the first act, you have to know what happens in Act 2 and Act 3. You must see that the light that fades at the crucifixion shines so brightly at the resurrection that it explodes into the world and it continues to shine today. So those are the 3 acts of John in the story of Jesus. But it's not just a story. I want to ask you this on this Christmas Eve. Where are you in the story of Jesus? Not where are you in the Gospel of John, but where are you personally in hearing and receiving the light that Jesus brings into the world? You see, some people hear the Nativity and they hear Christmas, and Christmas is the cute, cuddly little Jesus, right? And we're so enamored with him. Oh, it's so cute, and we love Christmas, and it's great. It really is. But it's the first act. There's more to it. You see, do you only see that flicker of light? And some people just look at Jesus in that first act and go, "Oh, he's really cute, that's nice." But nothing more than that. Nothing more than just something someone you think about once a year. Or are you at the end of Act 2? Are you personally still at the crucifixion? When you see Jesus, do you see only death and defeat and discouragement in your life? Do you only see that the light has faded? That when you look at Jesus, you look at it and go, "Yeah, it was good, but yeah, there's not really much good that came out of it. It's kind of a sad story." I hope that you don't stop with Act 1 or Act 2, but I hope that you will embrace the final act that Jesus had, and that you will not stop at the birth of Jesus or the crucifixion of Jesus, but that you will know that the resurrection completes the story. That the resurrection sees the hope of eternity shining into a dark world. And I don't know where you're at. I don't know what kind of year you've had. If it's like most people, you've had a few bright spots, but you've had some pretty dark moments as well too. I encourage you, I pray for you tonight. Let the light of Jesus, the light of hope, shine into your world tonight. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Father, thank you for what you have done for us. Thank you for sending Jesus to us. And Father, I know that it's great to see the story of Jesus in the Nativity. And what happened there was truly miraculous and amazing. But I pray that we don't stop there. Father, I pray that we don't stop at the crucifixion. Father, I pray that we will see the story to the end, where you shine your light into a dark world. And Father, I know that many of us here today feel like the world is a pretty dark place. But I pray we won't let it stay that way, that we'll allow you to shine into our own hearts, into our own lives, and we will shine that light to everyone we see. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.